presenter at tonight's format by saying I'm probably not very good at looking at the chat. So I would prefer, if possible, everyone just say their contributions out loud, raise their hands and things like that. You can raise your hand either by this way or on the blue one. I'll try to keep both in a line of vision. Okay, all right. Okay, so today we're gonna have a very interesting talk by Tyler, and I think it's gonna change in a certain way an emphasis, as you'll find out, and I think you've seen from the abstract, onto the textual aesthetics and a kind of a biosemiotic methodology for writing about biosemiotics. And in addition to this, after Tyler's presentation is done, we decided to do something kind of novel today, which I hope will work, or freshen it up. In addition to everyone coming in with their regular comments, Tyler has put together a set of kind of targeted questions he'd like to ask different people here about these ideas, okay? So when we go through those, everyone should feel free to contribute to all of the questions, but it's just kind of a different way to see if we can structure the glade a little differently this time, see how it works. Doesn't work, we can do it again, okay? Okay, all right, so Tyler, I will give the screen over to you.
How's the sound?
Perfect.
That's good. Okay. Thank you very much. So, recursivity. Recursivity is already widely accepted as basic in biosemiotics and is already discussed in many of the major works. My argument is that this basic status of recursivity dictates certain methodological considerations, which are not so widely acknowledged. But these considerations show up as matters of style or aesthetic in a certain way of writing, and I emphasize that this recursive way of writing also shows up in many of the great works of biosemiotics, such as in Jesper Hoffmeyer's work, which I will focus on later. But even there, this textual recursivity is not acknowledged as such. That is, the recursivity of the object of interest in biosemiotics is acknowledged already. And recursivity appropriately does show up as a textual method there in Jesper's work, as one example. But the link is not specified. And I would urge only that this link be clarified and that this style perhaps be advanced a couple steps further, modest steps. And I'll show you just what I mean by this. And also in the process, I will briefly promote my own recent dissertation. Where I discuss these matters. And where I call them the biosemiotic aesthetic function, hence the subtitle. Aesthetics and style are not biosemiotic problems, but if we think about biosemiotics as a genre and a kind of writing, we already notice definitely certain stylistic trends, which I think are very nice. and which we may capitalize upon, actually. But first, I want to address recursivity at the level of biology. So I'll talk very briefly about incomplete nature for 2 slides, and you'll see that my topic is quite a bit different from Deacon's, obviously. And this is not just another Terry masterclass by any means, but I think his formulation here is the most specific. And so I see that there's no way around talking about incomplete nature, even if just briefly, very briefly, 2 slides. As you know, the autogen is his concepts to explain the minimal teleodynamic unit at the threshold between life and non-life. And in chapter 10 on autogenesis, we get a clear and direct link between recursivity and self-reference. And there it is explained how the maintenance of self-similarity marks the threshold between inanimate self-organization and semiosis, or, quote, this self-reconstituting dynamics provides an active self-similarity maintaining quality, which constitutes a form of individuality or self that does not otherwise exist outside of living processes. And this is a familiar argument already from Jesper Hoffmeyer, from Stuart Kaufman, not to mention Varela and Maturana and their autopoiesis. But I think that Terry takes the whole discussion a considerable step forward, specifically between chapters 12 and 14 of Incomplete Nature, where the link between evolutionary biology and information theory is made more explicit. He asks us to consider the classical definition of information from Shannon and Weaver. As we know, the idea of entropy defines information as a statistical irregularity. The order of a message is only discernible against the backdrop of the noise and the static of the channel. And when the noise of the channel exhibits a uniform distribution, then the very order of the message appears as an irregularity, but which can only be identified as such by comparing it with the noise, and thus, quote, without reference to this absent background of possible alternatives, the amount of potential information of a message cannot be measured. So this I take to be basic information theory, but he takes a considerable step further when he defines referential information as that which preserves the constraints of the channel of its own transmission. That is, the physical characteristics of the channel of transmission, which themselves limit the possible number of future states in a transformation, are somehow included within the message. And so this idea is also crucial for understanding the transition between levels in emergent dynamics, where self-organization on the one hand is defined by constraint amplification, and semiosis, on the other hand, is defined by constraint preservation. Now, this is a very tricky distinction, which I don't fully understand, but the point is that if the physical constraints of the channel must be preserved in order to get a purchase on this so-called referential information, we are already talking about a kind of self-preservation. And what this implies to me is that all interpretation is biological. And it seems to me that this is a great way to understand the real crux of biosemiotics. But to repeat, the idea is just that in natural selection, not just the elimination of alternatives, but the spontaneous production or generativity of the new forms as noisy mutations, if you will, is also important. And here, of course, we're reminded of the much discussed idea of exaptation from Stephen Jay Gould and its connection perhaps also with the notion of bricolage used by Lévi-Strauss and Jacques Derrida. So inadvertently, this idea of the noise in the channel raises what I consider to be textual and aesthetic problems. When referential information uses the constraints of the channel to trace its own imprint, if you will, it, quote, transforms the incidental and accidental into the significant and the indispensable. What might this mean for the methodology of biosemiotics as a practice? whose channel of transmission definitely is a textual one. It means that the noise of this channel must also be preserved within the descriptive system, within the writing. This aesthetic fact is already acknowledged in some biosemiotics, as I will address. But it also has an instructive precedent in German idealist romanticism and naturalism, and this may at first seem like a digression, disconnected to the main topic, but I pose this link not only to clarify the historical precedent for an aesthetics of biosemiotics, but also because of how important Charles Peirce is to biosemiotics and how Peirce doesn't fall quite as far from the tree of German idealism as many scholars of Peirce want to claim, and because late German idealism poses definite answers to the problem of recursivity. We also see that this line of inquiry leads down a sometimes darker forest path, sometimes slightly morbid, oftentimes more pessimistic, which is a style that I personally find very attractive, but whether it is appropriate to biosemiotics is, I guess, a matter of what you think the future holds in ecology, environment, and even evolution, perhaps. But already from Immanuel Kant, we can say that the problem of recursivity was not as simple as mere self-reference. This is dealt with in Kant's third critique, the one on aesthetics, which is called the Critique of Judgment. And this is where he tells us about the real continuity of natural and artistic beauty, and where he says that the duty of art is to restore the sensory experience of the environment to us and of our own physiology prior to its cognitive self-apprehension. But crucially, it is not the job of the artist to merely reproduce the image of nature. That would be what he calls naive romanticism. Instead, what art reproduces is the non-instrumentality of nature. That is, the appearance of the absence of purpose, or the appearance of randomness. And this aesthetic doctrine is called disinterested interest, or purposeless purposefulness, depending upon the translation. And the non-instrumentality of nature feeds directly into the laws of aesthetic judgment. For instance, you are a customer buying a piece of land and property. To you, the opinion of the real estate salesperson about the beauty of the landscape cannot be trusted. Or as another example, you are a purveyor of wines and you own your own vineyard. Your judgment of your own wine also cannot be trusted because you have a definite interest in this wine. So it is not a valid aesthetic judgment to say, this is an excellent bottle of wine because the grapes came from my grandfather's vineyard. The point being that the continuity of natural and artistic beauty in this way has the same stepladder continuity of matter and mind, punctuated with emergent thresholds, which we find in Charles Peirce's Cynicism, and in the quote, continuity between bodily sensation and understanding, once again challenging the mind-body dualism to which the idealists and empiricists continually fall prey. The genius of pragmatic inquiry, like the genius of Kantian creativity, ought to be regarded as a gift of nature, as being continuous with and arising from natural processes of organic life. So we do see that the aesthetic problem of recursivity is already addressed in Peircean biosemiotics. And here I would point specifically to the writings of Jesper Hoffmeyer, who, quote, suggests then that the biosemiotic core of the heart of the human aesthetic is rooted in the making sensible of human expressions and feelings. This biosemiotic understanding of aesthetic origins might change our conception of the interrelation of aesthetics and ethics. One may object here that by aesthetic, Hoffmeyer means just the study of environmental perception and sensation, and that he is really not interested in art or literary theory. But I think it's pretty clear that what he means here extends also to questions of style, and that this extension also shows up in his own writing. Recursivity as an aesthetic problem is addressed in a number of easily understandable ways throughout art history. In literature, even just the division of author and narrator or fictionalization is an early meditation on recursivity. But this kind of naturalism in literature is recursive already in the Deaconian sense, I argue. This kind of naturalism, which shows up already in Jesper's writing, takes up superfluous environmental detail into the narrative and is modified by those details, which is a way, I argue, of preserving the constraints of the channel. Within the scientific work, autobiographical asides may sometimes interrupt the line of argumentation, and sometimes from these mistakes, whole new conclusions are arrived at. And we find this whimsical improvisation in many of the best works of biosemiotics, especially in Hoffmeyer's work. You may recall, for example, how Jesper concludes Signs of Meaning in the Universe with an odd autobiographical aside about Günter Grass and his dedication to Salman Rushdie on the anniversary of the fatwa, and how Salman Rushdie was a man who celebrated mistakes and failures. Jesper then transitions on the third page, or the third to final page of his great work, to remind that, quote, "The tendency to make mistakes lies at the root of all true development in this world. If no errors had ever arisen in the DNA molecules, life would never have progressed beyond the amoeba stage." Maybe Jesper wrote the bit about Rushdie while in a cafe somewhere, or on an airplane while under some reflective reverie. Either way, this fragmentary reflection was preserved and repurposed into the narrative. It has no connection to the argument, and what looks like a mistake helps to really memorably punctuate the conclusion of this already great book, instead of simply ending on a dry scientific formulation about biological mutation, which is what he was supposedly talking about. And in a scientific text, to make even such a modest aesthetic aside as this is already to break the rules a little bit. But Jesper maintains, and I agree, that such rule breaking is necessary. And it is also already a kind of recursivity, that is, the appearance of the absence of purpose in the disruption of the linear argumentation and deferral of conceptual closure, which is created by aesthetic recursivity. And while, although, quote, self-reference is not necessarily paradoxical, it is the bane of logic because it breaks the rules, so to speak. It puts us into a kind of hall of mirrors where it becomes impossible to distinguish between a statement and what that statement concerns. Like a map which is so detailed that the cartographer and the map he is making are swept up into it. We see that this passage comes from a section of the book dedicated to the importance of self-reference in the account of subjectivity in biosemiotics. And from this, we see that if we are trying to express non-linguistic meanings, or we are trying to express the meanings of nature, the method is not to point to nature or to mimetically depict nature. Naive romantic conventions can never succeed in reproducing the actual grandeur of nature. But the non-instrumentality of nature itself can be reproduced. And this is the key. This is the approach that was taken from late idealism and which has also been realized in some of the other 20th century semiotics, non-biosemiotic, other semiotics. And Hoffmeyer sees all this. When it comes to textual recursivity, his writing falls somewhere in between anecdotal, romantic, autobiographical on the one side, and the modernist, expressionist, and more distorted approaches on the other side. I would urge it to step one step further to this other side, because I think the need for mistakes is even greater than he told us. I think special strategies are required to prevent any discourse from ossifying into non-semiotic dogma. Jesper told us how symbolic concepts can't fully restore nature, and that instrumental rationality itself is totally linked to environmental degradation. Mistakes must be amplified and then preserved because mutation is necessary, and because somehow in art, it is only the failure of representation which somehow manages to succeed in representing recursive subjectivity. This aesthetic lesson is, of course, the lesson of modernity, and entails the concrete link between ethics and aesthetics Jesper mentioned 2 slides ago. It also speaks to a way of being accountable to environmental degradation, for example, but which is yet purely formalistic and makes no direct commentary on any social or environmental initiatives. We find that much may be implied through certain stylistic choices without being forced into definite parties or camps. Such writings nevertheless succeed in affecting a definite mood, as I have mentioned. And the subgenre of ecosemiotics or ecosemiotics provides some good examples. Timo Maren and Kalevi's paper a few years back asserts very clearly that, quote, human symbolic semiosis with its capacity for decontextualization and environmental degradation are deeply related. These cognitive manipulations of the environment are followed by its physical manipulation. Or better yet, when it comes to the style and the mood of this problem, back in 2016, there was a presentation at the Semiosalon series by Reen Magnus titled Losing the Sense of Suffering. And there, she reviewed some eco-criticism and some deep ecology, and she argued that environmental degradation correlates with the loss of cultural spaces in which to process the experience of personal suffering. And the whole presentation had a really somber and serious romantic mood about it. And everybody left the presentation a bit moved, I would say. And such effect does need to be achieved, and not by heavy-handed moralizing, nor by merely giving statistics or by proving theories. The presentation conveyed a real sense of the magnitude of loss that is mostly unconsciously experienced during times of cataclysmic change, whether that change be related to biodiversity and glaciers, or perhaps even to the loss of personal liberties in a time of crisis. In retrospect, this somber but moderate pessimism and sense of helplessness may appear to our readership as a real wisdom. But whether this is true is, again, a matter of what you think the future actually holds, of course. But either way, I would like to see this style pushed a bit further because, as Kant already informed us, it is not sufficient to merely represent nature. In the classic aesthetics of romanticism we find in Hoffmeyer and in ecosemiotics, if it is to continue to convey this loss in a really affective way, we'll need to more seriously process the implications of the quote from Timo and Kalevi at the top of the slide, which says that purely symbolic language will always fail to adequately present this. I would like to see the truly modernist motif be better absorbed in biosemiotics. The philosopher Greg Horowitz perfectly captures this idea in a work about the aesthetics of Kant and Hegel and their relevance for postmodern art, where he notes that, quote, beauty is the impossible reconciliation of the interpreting subject with her own lost nature. If we drop impossible from this last sentence, we get romanticism. This beauty must be the product of a real absence of determinate intention. It must be the appearance of that absence. And here we arrive at the real textual methodological problem. What is the appearance of the absence of determinate intention? In this book, Horowitz ultimately says that even surrealism and Dada demonstrate the same continuity of nature and culture that Kant was talking about. In other words, the absence of determinate intention really is just a kind of randomization, or at least the appearance of randomness. And this may already seem a bit extreme, or perhaps it seems not relevant to the biosemiotic project. But I would simply remind that the great writing of biosemiotics already embraces this randomness in its own understated fashion. And my proposal is not to change this writing, but only to urge it a very small step further in the same direction in which it's already headed. And in my recently defended PhD dissertation, I go into greater detail about the places in biosemiotic writing where I see recursivity and its method engaged directly. As you can see in section 5.5, towards the bottom, I label these cases of stylistic recursivity the biosemiotic aesthetic function. And in this section of my work, I talk about how when I read both Sternfeld and Deacon, I already see a more advanced aesthetic function happening. Sternfeld's diagrammatology has a certain kind of eclecticism, which I call hyperdense meta theory, whose result is that it is impossible to classify his book really as any kind of scientific treatise. It's not even really a work of biosemiotics, not really, but actually, I think of it as a semiotics proper, partially because of this eclecticism that I'm mentioning, which in his book just happens to be interested also in problems of biology, as I would say. But if you honestly look at diagrammatology, you see there such a chaos and profusion of different ideas that we are hard put to classify it at all. And I argue that it is just this breakdown which constitutes its recursivity, and hence also its greatness, and the reason why it is such a megalith in the literature of semiotics today. That being said, I have some serious problems with this book, and I want to, I won't bore you with them fully here, but I will use these problems as a transition to my conclusion. That is, I disagree completely with Sternfeld's critique of Umberto Eco, and I'll tell you why. Because in my opinion, it is Eco who gives us the most practicable answers for defining and implementing recursivity. My main point of attack against Sternfeld is that he repeats this basic commonplace disavowal of structural semiology that we hear all the time. This is the claim that semiology is only concerned with verbal language, and that therefore semiology is anthropocentric or logocentric or whatever. In the first chapter of my dissertation, I go to great lengths to refute this claim. Semiology, whether it be that of Saussure or of Hjelmslev or Barthes or Eco, is neither logocentric nor anthropocentric. And it irritates me a bit that Sternfeld repeats this commonplace because he knows better, especially regarding Hjelmslev. Further, anyone who has read Eco, even from his earliest works, knows that he was quite clear on this point. He himself even discredits those semiologists who would presume to restrict sign use to verbal language, when he observes that, quote, during the 60s, semiotics was dominated by a dangerous verbocentric dogmatism, whereby the dignity of language was only conferred on systems ruled by double articulation. In this passage, or in this section from A Theory of Semiotics, Eco cites semiologist Louis Prieto for 3 pages on the different kinds and numbers of articulation a system of signs may have. And although this passage in Eco's book gives no direct comment on the problem of anthropological difference, Prieto's own work does give the indication that signs are not exclusively a human concern, and Eco is aware of this implication. And our friend with us today, Israel, will be happy to tell you much, much more about the non-human applications of Prieto's semiology. But what they are all agreed upon anyway, Eco, Barthes, Prieto, and Hjelmslev, was that the findings of semiology ultimately confirm the existence of some, quote, profound articulatory matrix that is both multimodal and multi-species. In other words, it is possible to read semiology and biosemiotics as being interested in the very same matrix. And we have good reason to do so because the former offers us concrete answers to the problem of recursivity. That is because semiology offers us concrete answers to this problem. And when we read semiology this way, we can even read Roland Barthes sympathetically in this way, when he writes that, quote, there exists a general category, laying speech, which embraces all the systems of signs. Since there are no better ones, we shall keep these terms language speech, even when they are applied to communications whose substance is not verbal. You may ask, What are the equivalents of language and speech in nonverbal semiotics? I answer as Echo told us. They are type and token, or legisign and synsign, as Peirce called them. I would further rhetorically ask, what is Sternfeldt's DC sign doctrine but a more advanced structuralism? DC sign doctrine generalizes the propositional structure of subject and predicate into index and icon and demonstrates its multimodal and multi-species application. This is no different from Barth's structuralist homology. There is no reason to disavow semiology. The only real difference we have with the semiologists is that they did tell us that we cannot prove the existence of the non-linguistic semiosphere, other than by means of showing the breakdown of language itself. They told us that it is only within the inconsistencies and the failures of symbolic representation that we may discover and apprehend this non-linguistic meaning. But we know now this is not strictly true. And so, to close, I want to point back again to Terry's work and to make the claim, which I argue at length in my dissertation, that it is from the symbolic species that we get the best confirmation of the importance of semiology and structuralism. And it's not actually a question of symbolic or not symbolic. It has more to do with the subtitle of his book about the co-evolution hypothesis. And so this is what I tell my semiologist friends. We don't believe in biosemiotics. We try to discredit biosemiotics. I tell them, best evidence for the importance of what you do comes from biosemiotics. And then I explain to them the co-evolution hypothesis, which is the idea that the capacity for so-called symbolic reference arose long before spoken language itself actually came into use, and that this capacity for language already began exerting evolutionary pressure on the brain at that time. To quote Terry, if language is a comparatively recent feature of human social interaction, that is, if it is only, say, 100,000 years old or so, then we should expect that it had little effect on human brains. On the other hand, if language has been around for a good deal of our evolutionary past, say 1 million years or so, that amount of time would have been adequate for the demands of language to have affected brain evolution more broadly. In other words, there is scientific evidence for the existence of the semiosphere, and semiology will be well advised to heed the findings of biosemiotics for this reason, if it desires to remain relevant in a time when Saussurian linguistics, at least, has indeed lost most of its relevance. But it is more likely that semiology and structuralism will pay attention to biosemiotics if biosemiotics pays attention to it. And this is the major point of my dissertation, because as I have suggested, recursivity as method is already present throughout the biosemiotic literature. But it could be updated by no longer disavowing structural semiology, but instead learning something from the style of semiology, because semiology poses concrete answers for integrating textual recursivity with the empirical strategies of biosemiotics. As I put it in my 2-page summary, this reflexive aesthetic preserves the ongoing mutation of biosemiotic writing and prevents it from ossifying into non-semiotic dogma. And by structural semiology, I do also mean deconstruction, post-structuralism, and ideology critique, because recursivity doesn't stop at aesthetics. It is also interlinked with ethics and politics. That is, accountability to recursivity entails a different motif and mood, and may take more explicitly transgressive aspect. I do understand the delicacy of this last part, and that such transgression should not align itself explicitly with any environmental or political agenda necessarily, but instead proceed purely formalistically from the basis of theory. And thankfully, we already have a lot of good examples to follow in this innovation.
Okay, very good. Very, very nice, Tyler. All right. Well, let's open up the first 45 minutes or so with questions to Tyler. And then we have some time. We'll take some questions from Tyler, which we have already listed out in a separate document. So the floor is open. questions about whatever you've heard? Yes, Tori.
Can I just start with a comment and I'll formulate a question a little bit later. It was a fantastic presentation. It was very clear and I applaud what you're doing. I of course have an interest in the aesthetics of biosemiotics and yeah, just very, very well done. Very clear.
Much appreciated, Tori. Much appreciated. One of my questions was directed at you actually, and it has to do with the problem of creativity and narrative, how to integrate your interests in narrative, like your own narrative writing, for example, and whether and in what ways does recursivity already inform your thinking in trying to talk about narrativity in biosemiotics and vice versa, like in what you're doing?
Well, I believe that recursivity is semiosis and the constant reconfirmation of a semiotic habit, and creativity is when some mistaken use of a representation takes the habit in a new direction. So it sort of spirals in a different way. So I don't think you can have a poetics without without understanding the semiotics first as the ground for which creativity is possible. I think that I'm going to find your dissertation really useful. So, haven't read it yet, but I have it.
You so should.
Okay. Any other questions to Tyler about? And
with the way that you explain it, kind of sounds like unlimited semiosis, and of course, which is an idea that Eco took from Peirce, and just whether it's a genuinely Peircean idea or not is widely disputed. Another one of the sub-arguments in my dissertation is that this whole claim that Eco got Peirce wrong and that unlimited semiosis is a mistake is overstated. It's overstated, and Eco didn't get Peirce wrong. Eco read Peirce selectively. That's true, but he was very clear that he was doing that. And this whole argument, mostly it comes from T.L. Short about Eco's wrongness about Peirce and about the ultimate interpretant and about the status of the Peircean object. How discourse independent is the Peircean object, and how much like the thing in itself, the Kantian thing in itself, is the Peircean object actually. And so Eco chose to read Peirce a bit more on the side of the idealism, on the side of German idealism, which he was also very explicit about. Other scholars want to say it's otherwise, but definitely, and it's purposefully done also too, partially in fact to hamstring the attempt to apply Peirce to problems of culture, problems of literature, because he doesn't like what Eco and Derrida also, for instance, were doing with Peirce. And so that's just my position on the matter.
Okay, Paul and Josh can follow up. If whoever comment goes better with Tyler's last statement, it would be Paul or Josh.
Josh. I just have a question, a clarification. I did read your summary, and it was a great presentation. Thank you so much. Just a clarification on semiology. You stated a couple times, and the answer to this question just didn't sink into my brain. You mentioned that semiology uses recursivity to solve a problem, and I guess my question is twofold. Like, what problem do you feel like, or what are the bounds of the problem that it's solving, and then what is its solution? So, what is the question and what is the answer with respect to recursivity from a semiology point of view? Thanks.
Yes. The problem is accessibility of the so-called object, in post-linguistic turn, kind of assertion that all problems are linguistic problems, and we may be able to speak about non-linguistic truth or non-linguistic entities, but it's always, once again, within language that we do so, and thus a philosophy which starts from the premise of a referent, of including a referent within the system of description, is already committing a kind of fallacy. And the semiologists took this idea of linguistic turn to the extreme and said, well, then indeed there is nothing outside the text, or at least to speak of it is to commit an error. And thus the only way for us to get to that thing outside the text is to expose inconsistencies in language itself by inducing breakdown in language. A number of different ways that this can be done. But their hypothesis was just that when this breakdown is accelerated to a certain degree, the interpreting subject, that's when the interpreting subject experiences discourse independent reality, when the descriptive system breaks. So it's the experience of discontinuity or incompatibility, I guess, which just is the object, I guess.
So it's like intentionally turning up the noise, so to speak.
Yes, that's a way of putting it.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Actually, before I go to the next, I'm going to build on Josh's question, Tyler. So how, is there a specific way that biosemiotics you think should be engaging in that practice? The practice has already been engaged in, right? The post-structuralists have done it. What is what, as Josh said, you noted the problem that you see, and you claim semiology has an answer. What does this answer look like for biosemiotics? Is it different than it looks like for general semiotics?
Yes, it is different. Yes,
How?
and I do not endorse, or I would never presume to suggest that biosemiotics should incorporate the more extreme textual practices, which I find to be endlessly interesting, but nevertheless, the aim of biosemiotics is not completely different, but it is different. And so we can treat texts about neuroscience and texts about cognition in the way that semiology does. There are only texts. We treat them purely as texts and immanently. We perform an immanent critique of the texts and we mash them together or whatever, and we expose inconsistencies between these texts. But nevertheless, biosemiotics chooses texts which themselves are committed to discourse independent reality and empirical strategies which presume the existence of a non-linguistic reality. And that's what distinguishes or should distinguish it, is that its chosen texts are these texts. And that's enough in and of itself, I think, to define biosemiotics as a genre and to not let it spin out of control into a deconstructive mess, it seems to me.
Or into what you called at the end, non-semiotic dogma. Do you want to talk about that? You mean like a scientism?
Well,
or naive realism?
I mean, I think it should be clear how this approach to biosemiotics would prevent it from becoming anything like that. But again, I would emphasize already that I already see that biosemiotics is well protected from this problem, more or less. It's already, I mean, certainly the texts that I choose to discuss in my dissertation, all of them are already doing it. They're already doing what I would say needs to be done. And the only complaint I would have, say, for example, with Sternfeldt's work, whose work I think is the most, like, it's with regard to achieving this effect, I think it's the best work. But nevertheless, all I would ask of him is to not idly trash on Echo, first of all, but especially, he's really hard on Derrida, and he talks about the French philosophies of difference, like a pejorative, like these French philosophies of difference. Okay, it only irritates me. It shouldn't bother any of you. It bothers me because that's what I'm into. And I don't see the need for that, because I read his text like a deconstructed text. That's what it is. Like, it's a huge mess of different theories just crammed together. He just happens to be brilliant enough that the narrative carries it along. You know, it's a deconstructed text, so I just don't see the need. I think it may be politically motivated. I guess a lot of my argumentation personally is politically motivated.
Well, Tyler, to be
I'll let Paul go.
scrupulously fair about this, you know, and to lead to the defense of Frederick. Sorry.
I'm going to finish this and I'm going to give it to you.
Okay.
The point you make towards that in your dissertation is that you're trying to get people to read more and not tell them don't read this. That a lot of the people against semiology were saying don't read this, right?
Yeah,
and you're
disavowal. Yes. Let's just purge the disavowal. If you don't like a thing, then just don't talk about it.
Okay. And then we have Paul, and then we have Jamin, and then we have Kalebi. Paul.
Well, to leap to Frederick's defense on this, there is an issue, and that is to do with the fact that we are this small, pretty lowly grouping. And I think what he's referring to, and it may not be condonable, but what he's referring to is an extremely powerful block in the academy for like 20, 30,
Yeah.
perhaps much longer. And I know personally that he very much, he turned to biosemiotics in response to that. So it may be a personal thing, but I think it's probably more than a personal thing. But anyway, that's merely a preamble to the fact that I was going to say almost 30 years to the day, I went to see Jacques Derrida, and it was an event that was held by Amnesty International, and he was asked by his interlocutor, he was asked, what is human rights? Isn't that something that's very stable, and that we should like insist upon human rights as being one particular thing, and it's something to fight for, and some ultimate reference point? And he gave a fantastic answer. It went on and on for quite a long time, but the crux, which is quite a familiar argument that we would know now, the crux was that human rights can't be left at the mercy of stability. What it needs to do is develop in a future orientation, but constantly refer back to its foundations, to revise itself, to take into account contextual factors, to be alive to all its determinations, to not rely on self-identity, etc., etc., etc. And of course, I'm tempted, when I start to think about this about 10 years later, I'm tempted to think about that answer in terms of recursivity. But what I did wish, and probably like we share this, is I wish they'd ask Umberto Eco, because if you remember during that same period, there's this set of arguments, which we will label with the term Umberto Eco, about interpretation and over-interpretation. And I wonder what the difference would have been in that second perspective, the one of Eco, because you will remember that he similarly chides deconstruction. He chides Derrida from what could broadly be called the Peircean pragmatist direction. I have to imagine what his question would be about human rights, but his would be more based on a version of recursivity, which is somehow determined by, Peirce doesn't use this term, but we use it, the community of interpreters. What do you think?
Well, on the first point, I actually mentioned this in my pre-defense about how I think that I was born a little bit later, but that if I had been born just 10 years ago, my attitude about deconstruction would be totally different, because I would have been swamped with students doing deconstruction in the way that many scholars in the humanities were, and totally sick of Lacan, sick of hearing about Lacan also. Whereas the situation has changed now. I think the situation has changed dramatically in the humanities. And it's not as fashionable as it once was. And the disavowal of Derrida and of Lacan, I think, is a more serious problem. Because it's one thing to have a ton of students writing nonsense papers. That is a bad thing, but it's something that we can manage. It's quite another thing if academia is purged of all of its leftist criticism. And some will say that it's the opposite case. Some will argue that, like in the United States, for example, that the universities have been taken over by these leftists and these nihilists and so on. But like, I'm pretty sure that's not the case. I'm pretty sure the actual case, and you've written about this yourself, Paul, I'm pretty sure the actual case is that academia has been managerialized beyond recognition, and people treat their degrees like business management degrees. And they're all in it for profit now because they have been told that that's the only value that they should respect. And so that's the real problem. We should remember who our enemy is. It hasn't changed just because Derrida became fashionable for a while.
Okay, Jamin.
Tyler, thank you for the presentation. I'm really eager to read your dissertation. Please send me a copy, or you probably have it online for download. I'll have to check.
We can put it in the chat, Tyler, before we end tonight. Yeah?
Okay. Yeah.
Put the PDF in the chat.
I can do that.
The presentation is just bristling or sparkling with good ideas and areas to follow up on. The one that we've been talking about most recently in this discussion, I'm fully on board with and would like to dialogue with you further. And I think it's one reason why we're fortunate, I think, that CBIOC and started the IESS with semiologists, and they just went ahead and called the whole thing semiotics, because the compatibilities between the two go much deeper. The one that you mentioned than we tend to recognize in our folk conversations or off the cuff ideologies. The one point that you mentioned as just quickly, and I wonder if you deal with it further in your dissertation. You mentioned offhand that types and tokens are one way in which we can blend structuralism with Peircean semiotic in identifying continuity between human communication through language and other species communication. One thing I was interested in, and this gets to the core of my question, is that you didn't mention the third part of the actual triad in Peirce's system anyways, which is tone, type, token, and tone, which would really, I think, tie into the heart of your discussion on aesthetics, which is the major transforming force for pulling the discussion of recursivity out of the purely mechanistic and algorithmic discussions that it tends to fall into. And that's the major innovation of your dissertation. I'm sure there's many more, but just listening to it, that's really, really important. And I think it also ties in with what Morten Tønnesen was talking about in discussing his chapter from his book that he's co-authored with Alexei last week, in discussing Umwelt phenomenology. We're talking about phenomenology, we're talking about aesthetics. If we're talking about aesthetics, we're talking about feeling. If we're talking about feeling, we're talking about tone and the grounding of iconic sin signs and iconic legisigns in qualisigns, that without which there's no meaning, without which nothing matters, which brings things back around to Deacon's first chapter, in which he wants to say what's missing is a theory of something missing, and why that matters is because nothing matters without it. So this, I think this is the future of semiotics in a big way, re-enchanting and reintroducing the importance of imagination, but not as a mechanistic, not as a mechanistic specter, or simply something mystical that can't be discussed, but as something that's grounded in feeling that integrates human being with all other being. Now that seems like an observation, but I'll bring it back around to the specific question on type, token, and tone. Whether or not you bring that up in your dissertation, and I'm interested in that, do you think that's a crucial link?
Well, leaving out the qualisign is one way of making sure that compatibility with structuralism or semiology can happen. I will note that I stole a word, I took a cue from your book, this chiasmus. You use this term, right? Chiasm.
Oh yeah.
I named my echo chapter Echo's chiasm, something or other, and with inspiration from your use on this term. Because Echo describes the division of his own book between sign function and sign production in terms of an irresolvable chiasmus. And I like the way that you use that word. Anyway, I leave out quali. One excuse for leaving out the quali sign is because to account for this qualia in any kind of positivistic way is to commit just the error that the semiologists were resolved not to commit. And it's not to say that I don't value the trichotomy anyway. And also, I do indeed address it. Actually, I address tychism, which is, I guess, this kind of, you could say, is the study of firstness, or the study of qualia in a way. But I like tychism because the way that Peirce describes it is in terms of chance and you can say in terms of contradiction, like how is chance defined other than by an incompatibility? And so thus, I really like the approach to firstness and qualia, like through the notion of incompatibility, because it doesn't really even devolve into the sort of positivistic labeling of this, what is irreducible or ineffable substance or whatever it is. And so, so we can use the Peircean typology and be true to it, I think, without going so far as in committing this, what they would consider to be a fallacy by positivistically labeling it. But so when I discuss cynicism, I do it in comparison with the idea of synchronicity from Jung, actually, in psychoanalysis, and free association. And that role there's a dissertation about necessity, chance, and the culturally subversive applications of Peirce's tychism or something like that, and which talks about Peirce for surrealism and psychoanalysis. And Vincent Calapietro also discusses this. So I do touch on qualia, but I don't even mention the polysign, synsign, legisign trichotomy at all. I don't think even once in my work. So.
Okay, so that was just an off the hand comment in the discussion, I realize now, but I think it really does tie in with your central points in important ways if you're talking about aesthetics.
I agree.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a conversation we should have.
You know, before we move on to Kalevi's question, which I guess is next, I realized that I dodged the second part of Paul's question.
Thanks for that. I was going to mention that it was an instance not of dodging, but very bad chairing.
Ooh.
No doubt.
Yeah, and prior to that, Don Favareau had been like talking over me, and insisting that he get the chance to have a second go at you. I was really wanted to hear what you said.
You're such a bully, Don.
Yeah. Loud, but a real good boss.
But yeah, I'd really like to hear. I mean, it may be that there's no that there's no choice to be made between the two positions, but you defended Eco, so I wondered what your perspective was on that, pragmatist aspect of.
Eco's the most important thinker for my dissertation because of his middle stance on this stuff, and he would have answered differently to this problem of human rights than Derrida did. Of course, Derrida refused to make any compromises. And it's one of the reasons why I respect him so much. We know from every interview that Derrida ever gave that he was no nihilist. He was no relativist. But you had to be pretty smart to be able to tell from the way that he spoke. You had to really listen and you had to really read his works. Whereas with Eco, there's no ambiguity, which is one thing that really frustrates me about some of the commentary on Eco and the attempts to discredit Eco because of his associations with deconstruction. Some, and I will name no names, but some authors have even insinuated that Eco himself was a relativist, or that his theory leads to relativism. This is absurd. It is absurd. And I won't have it, to be perfectly honest. But I will say, though, maybe we have a different position on this matter. But I think that Eco was more of a deconstructionist than posterity has allowed.
But in terms of recursivity, just to I mean, to be very pointed about the question, does the Eco's perspective, that pragmatist perspective that he has, unlimited semiosis versus drift, do you think that maps onto recursivity better than what he describes as drift?
You mean like bad hermetic drift?
Yeah.
Because I see unlimited semiosis, I see as a kind of hermetic drift. I mean, I see it as just that. I mean, that's where drift comes into play in Eco, and that's why Eco rehabilitates the idea of unlimited semiosis, or that's why he stresses it. I think is because of the necessity of drift. But this is crucially, though, I just would maintain that it's not a relativistic perspective. He just sees it as the only way of accessing the object without committing the positivistic fallacy, I guess.
Okay.
Nevertheless, the answer to the human rights problem, of course, would be much different from Eco than it is from Derrida. And Eco straddles the two positions better than anybody, and thus this is why he's the main man for me. But in my dissertation, actually, as you'll see if you look at it, I actually argue for his deconstruction, that Eco is more of a deconstructionist. I use the Foucault's pendulum in this book. And actually you could say, Eco described himself as a Persist, not a Persian, because he was willfully misreading Peirce. I think that it's possible that I also maybe willfully read Eco as more of a deconstructionist than he actually was. So, but I really liked your chapter on Eco in cultural implications of biosemiotics. I think it was one of the best treatments of Eco I've ever read, especially about code, and especially as Eco may be applied to biosemiotics clearly.
Well, you're very kind. I think it's probably because we both agree on Eco. I think we're on the same page.
Yeah, it seems that way.
Okay, Paul, do I have permission now to go to Kalevi?
I'll think about it.
Okay, go to
I'm
Kalevi.
interested to hear what Calevi's going to say.
Okay, thank you. So I completely agree with these main conclusions what were made about how semiotics should go on. But I would point out to two additional distinctions probably necessary. One is distinction between noise and error. In chat already, Victoria pointed out that. So because according to just information theory, classical information theory, noise, how it's defined there cannot be, say, interpreted as error. Never. So, and for that purpose, what follows from this, that mutation, as usually, biology understands that, is not an error. So there, some kinds of mutations can appear as errors, but in general, mutation is noise and not error. So, second distinction concerns the very definition of recursivity itself, or that concept. Because, say, biology started to be interested in recursivity something like 60 years ago, truly already. And that was related to modeling of mathematical modeling, including the self-reproduction. And then, so it appeared soon that actually the very simple, important in biology example of recursivity is just Fibonacci sequence. So, Fibonacci numbers. So this is a typical example of recursivity. So then further on, Mandelbrot's fractals. So again, but these are normally deterministic, purely deterministic examples of recursivity. So which, recursivity in this general way of general definition is obviously, something, a necessary aspect of semiosis, but far from being sufficient. So therefore, here distinction what's probably required is something like, typology of recursivities. So when we are going to speak about, so to say, semiotic recursivity, which would exclude these simple examples. And that is, I think, rather important distinction here. And now I think when now thinking about Umberto Eco's approach to the problem here, I see that his emphasis of or generalization of the concept of negotiation is one of his takes to semiotic recursivity. That negotiation is where actually always recursivity happens, but that's not that simple type anymore. I somehow see relatedness between how I understand choice and this negotiation by Eco, that these two are somehow very rather close to each other. So yeah, and if you would like to have also a question from me, that is, please explain what's non-instrumentality of nature according to your understanding.
I talk about instrumental rationality. I do not mean instrumentalism. I mean it more from Marxist criticism, from Eagleton. When Eagleton talks about instrumental rationality, he's talking about capitalism as a way of thinking. And thus, my use of the word instrumentality may not translate into the biological discussion directly. But I probably should have simply said was to use Kant's vocabulary only as the purposelessness, apparent purposelessness, or purposeless purposiveness of nature, which is in its appearance of randomization, the profusion of organic detail.
Okay, in that case, say purpose is something much more complex than intention, yeah, or goal.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it has to do with plans and concepts, and yes.
Okay, Ludmila.
Thank you very much for a brilliant presentation. My question is related to what Professor Kull said. Well, because there are many types of recursivity in general, and in biology, it was very famous to treat mathematical or algorithmical recursivity. But you talk about textual recursivity applied to biosemiotics. I understand it as a literary genre. And my question is, can we find textual recursivity in living beings, in organisms, as some inherent characteristics of life? And if yes, would this be a disclaimer of Chomsky's, defining recursivity as a species, a unique feature of like human species, language syntax? And I'm sorry, there are some construction works. Sorry for the noise.
In the dorm rooms, the Texas dorm rooms, always noisy. So are you asking if the specific recursivity, textual recursivity that I'm talking about is human specific?
Yes.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that there's a specific strategy of writing which is human specific. And that as semioticians, like all semioticians are humans. I know that even saying such things already, like you get in trouble because it's like it's anthropocentric or something, but like nevertheless, I mean, we can say that anyway, can't we? So I'm talking about, when I talk about textual recursivity, I mean, it's a thing which humans do, it's not, I mean, animals don't do it because they can't write. It's a kind of writing. Yes. That answers your question.
Yeah, because what I thought is to relate the textual recursivity to the works by Anton Markovitch, and in his recent book on epigenetics, he really understands evolution or evolutionary biology in historiographical terms, attributing to organisms some kind of storytelling, or this might be understood as textual recursivity.
Yes,
right?
so there is a continuity. There's a kind of non-textual recursivity, which is an object of interest in biosemiotics, which is characteristic of all science, yes. And textual recursivity is continuous with this pretextual recursivity in the same way as teleodynamics is continuous with morphodynamics, right? In this stepwise ladder function. And so the work of art is continuous with the beauty of nature, but not in a way that it can merely reproduce the image of nature. It has to, rather, as I put it before, perhaps incorrectly, it has to reproduce the non-instrumentality of nature, or as Kant put it, probably better, the disinterested interest or purposeless purposiveness of nature. And so in the same way, we have to think of recursivity, textual recursivity, as perhaps as emerging from non-textual recursivity by preserving the constraints, which themselves are amplified at the earlier level. I'm just using Deacon's terminology now because it was in the presentation. But this kind of non-reductive or non-decomposable emergent descriptive vocabulary of emergent dynamics, I think, is very useful for the problem. And also, I think has, as I said in the presentation earlier, has interesting precursors in German romanticism, German idealist aesthetics. In this way. Yes. Okay. Critique of Judgment, really useful, really interesting book for this discussion. So you shouldn't listen to those who say don't read Kant, because it's pretty interesting. That's why, Peirce talked about abduction, and abduction also furnishes a very interesting precedent for the whole discussion. But at the same time, we know that Peirce wasn't interested in aesthetics. And we also noticed that actually, it seems to me anyway, that the developments of Peircean, so-called Peircean aesthetics of abduction for the use of discussion of cultural objects like art, they really haven't gone anywhere. They haven't really yielded anything useful. So there's something missing from that discussion, from the discussion of abduction. And I think the idea of disinterested interest, for example, from Kant, is very useful for that.
Okay, Terry.
Well, hi all. I need to apologize for coming in late. I was having computer trouble. So if my question leads back to something you've already dealt with, you can just sort of brush me off. And this comes following Kalevi in another sense, but it's also because it's been a long-term interest of mine, and you maybe have covered it because of this. And that is the difference between recursivity within a level and recursivity across level, or what Doug Hofstadter would have called strange loops. As you probably know, my view on icon index symbol distinction is that you don't really get good recursivity, or you can't really get recursivity with iconic or indexical relations. That is, pictures of pictures operating on each other. Basically, it's like this hall of mirrors that just disappears. And all you can get is circularity if you get indexical recursivity. But symbols, because the symbolic relationship severs the signed vehicle properties from referential properties, you now have this capacity for cross-level. And when you talk about textual, of course, what you're dealing with is the ability that text, because it does that, it can bury reference many, many levels. But this gives it its hierarchical complexity. And I think, as your comments about aesthetics require that kind of embedding. The interesting thing about a lot of aesthetics is that, of course, it can use textual-like relationships to deal with iconic relationships, which is, again, makes this semiotic problem really complex. I wanted to also carry it back to something that you may remember that I've dealt with in terms of biosemiotics, and that is why the use of the DNA-RNA protein relationship allows recursivity, because it's the same kind of thing. If I can share my screen, you've probably seen this before. Let me see if I can get it to work here. Yeah, here, just a second. So here's so I argue that the Chomskyan story, I think, is the result, not that recursion is necessary for language, but as I've argued before, that once you have symbolic representations available, recursion comes for free for the reasons I just described. But I want to also recognize that the same kind of thing goes on with the DNA to protein to DNA modulation. Because the code, can everybody see this picture I've shown up here?
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, the idea is that you're using the isomorphisms between the base sequences to match up, and eventually by virtue of a contiguity relationship, something that you might say is an affordance for indexicality, you get this linkage to the structure of a protein. So that the sequence of the protein actually has a sort of, you might say, a non-iconic but iconic relationship with the base sequence. And so it's a little bit like symbolic displacement because of this. But because of that, and because this determines a different kind of molecular structure, the folding of a protein, it turns out that because the DNA molecule has a particular twist, it's got three-dimensional structure. And the regulation of DNA, of course, is the result of proteins binding to binding sites on a DNA molecule and activating or inactivating or potentiating DNA expression. So this is a kind of recursion, again, cross-level recursion that goes on that makes epigenetics possible. Epigenetics is possible precisely because of the kind of thing that the symbolic icon to index relationship that it gives you this displacement allows recursion. So my point here is that there seems to be this cross-level recursion that's really essential for higher biology, for the biology, any biology that uses epigenetic effects, and that allows the sort of hierarchy in biology. In the same sense, it allows the hierarchy textually with symbols, and I think aesthetically. And I thought it would be an interesting comparison to see that it really does apply across all these levels. And I was excited that became sort of the focus of your argument. So it's not really a question, but I was wondering if you sort of thought in these terms.
Well, not quite in these terms, but it's very illuminating. And I would wonder, my mind attempts to connect it to what Kalev was saying. If perhaps he challenged me on the different kinds of recursivity. Pointed out, of course, that the strange loops are deterministic and they're not the kind of recursivity that I'm talking about. And I wonder perhaps if this distinction between types has to do with the cross-level, single-level distinction.
I would think so. I think, and that's what Kalev's suggestion was to me as well.
Okay.
But it also has to do with displacement fundamentally, right?
Absolutely.
That's the difference between fractals and the Mandelbrot equations and semiosis.
Very good. Yeah, right.
It's very much to your dissertation, Tyler, this notion of the displaced absence, that which is the non-identity.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Paul.
Okay.
And then Josh.
Sorry, I'm off mute now. Yeah, I just wanted to, following up on something that Calavi said and something that Tori said in the chat about purposeless purposiveness. A great thing about this paper, it seldom happens, is it sent me off running to get books to check things and to cross-reference, and I got this one, this old one, which seems to address some of these issues. This is Michel Serres, The Parasite, old one from 1980 in the original French. And he instead of posing recursivity in the kind of positive ways that I referred to in respect to human rights and deconstruction and so on before, he poses it in terms of the parasite. I'll just read a little section. He says, the introduction of a parasite in a system is equivalent to the introduction of a noise. First example, I'm speaking polyphonically. The message is surrounded by nonsense, pure noise, disorder. The system crumbles and everything dies. The plague decimates a population. Mutation makes the fetus abort. And with that, the parasite, the assassin, commits suicide. The sponger falls back into the stream after having ruined his host. From information theory to anthropology, from signals to life, be it unique or numerous, the dynamics are stable and unchanging, always bringing about the same results. And you know, it's kind of bleak, but he poses it as a recursive process of rebuilding. You know, much different from the ways in which we tend to discuss recursivity. We discuss it as a kind of progressive entity with you know, the tendency is to discuss it not as ending up in dead ends, not as ending up in decay and destruction and so on. And then serves as this example of the parasite, in which, you know, that's precisely, if not analogous, it's essential to the process.
Josh?
Yeah, so really great conversation, because I'm glad people have brought up the different kinds of recursivity. And I'm particularly interested in the connection because, you know, my own profession has spanned from, you know, creative, you know, from architectural design now to, you know, biosemiotics. And I do believe that there is an important relation to be made between these different types of recursivity and, you know, the aesthetic, textual, and biosemiotics, with emphasis on the bio. And I think it centers on, I'm glad you brought up abductivity or abduction. I think it's critical. In fact, you know, my recent delving into Simondon, I think he would call it, you know, he's endeavored to create a transductive philosophy, and I would interpret his transductive, he talks of transductive logic as coming before inductive and deductive, that it's a necessary precursor, just as I believe abduction is a necessary precursor for, you know, in order to generate a hypothesis. And this idea of, you know, generating a hypothesis that's in of itself sort of effortless effort or disinterested interest, like intuition, if you will. I think Peirce talks about intuition, as does Simondon, as does many other folks. I think that what's missing in a lot of our conversations about recursivity is what I think Dawn nicely put in an email in response to our last discussion about sort of this aiming, that in the process of in this abductive process, this loop, this strange loop that Terry brought up, that kind of a chaos, if you will, like Calvi brought up, this, that it's indeterministic, but it's not just noise. That I think the trick, the danger, that I even sense that a biosemiotic community is falling into is that we want to just insert noise or randomness, and it's like, okay, that's all we need, and then that takes up the, you know, opening up that, the opening, you know, creating the possibility space, you know, the adjacent possible that Kaufman talks about and whatnot. I think that this notion of abduction is really critical, and that if you talk to Tori, ask Tori about, you know, the paper that we did. Creativity is really this critical other side of recursivity that I don't think we're really pushing quite in this. I want to hear more about abduction and how it is we're generating the circumstances for this effortless effort, this disinterested interest, where you're creating the hypotheses, the possible forms to be tested, without presupposing the solution, without deterministic recursivity, but it's neither is it just completely random noise. There's something else in between that I think is really critical. That you like Paul, you spurred me on to go dig into my, you know, general system theory, and actually Bertalanffy points out the danger of falling into this, like leaning on just pure randomness. It's a danger even in system theory for all its determinism. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for the motivation to dig into those things. But
probably in deconstruction and post-structuralism and so on, this fetishization of pure noise and randomness is indeed still a problem. Fortunately, in biosemiotics, I'm not sure that we really have this problem. Perhaps the opposite problem is more threatening. But I didn't respond directly to Paul's thing, and I had to think about it for a minute about this negative or bad recursivity, a parasitic recursivity, I guess.
Well, ultimately, SARS, finds it productive because it's the way in which in human groups you can have minority interests, minority interests which break down particular local systems. So the example he gives just after that is the play Tartuffe by Molière, where Tartuffe comes and disrupts everything in a household and breaks it down, and all the hypocrisies taken to their logical conclusion, and then the house is rebuilt.
Okay. Well, I wanted to return to it because it only occurred to me afterwards that there's a possible connection with what Kalevi was saying about types of recursivity. And of course, it occurred to me while writing this presentation, the title of my work, my dissertation, and so on, the main concept is the idea, what I call retroactivity, which is different and is designed purely in terms of this Yamslevian, well, it's a Peirce-Yamslev hybrid, which I've devised, which I showed at the end of it was on my last slide. And on the basis of this diagram, though, I did indeed derive two forms of retroactivity. And one is the one that I guess that we have been talking about, which seems to create unexpected results, I guess. And then the other is another one, I guess. Okay. I mean, there's another one. There are two kinds. That's my point. Two kinds of retroactivity. And one of them I associate with like deliberate textual randomization that's meant to like productively prevent ossification of discourses, I guess. But that's what I designate with it. And the other one actually corresponds with ideology. And the argument is that the ideological retroactivity works to eliminate particulars and preserve coherence, but in a way which can lead to this, again, this ossification, as I called it in my description. And the reason why this came to mind is just because, okay, two kinds of recursivity, one which isn't good, apparently one which is like parasitic. I sometimes describe ideology as operating like a symbolic parasite or something like that. I don't know if the connection between what you're saying and the typologies of recursivity that Kalevi and Deacon are talking about, I think maybe the connection is tenuous. It's tenuous at best. Still, I thought I would bring it up. Retroactivity.
Tyler, do you mind if I send your dissertation out right now?
Not at all. Go ahead.
Everyone? Okay, I'll call that right up. And then I'll call up, actually, while I'm doing that, I'll share a screen and I will call up Tyler's questions that he wrote. And anyone can answer any of these questions, but just we wanted to see if Tyler could put some questions to everyone here. So I'm going to share that with you while I'm sending his file. Well, that certainly didn't work, did it? You don't see it, do you?
No, we do. We see it.
Oh, you see it? Okay, so I don't see it, but that's fine.
We see it.
I don't know. Okay, so okay. So again, these questions are open to anyone who wants to weigh in on them. Do your best.
Don, can you make them a little larger? It's very small, hard for me to read.
Is it small? Okay, I'm sorry. To me, it almost fills up the whole screen here.
There we go. Wonderful.
Okay.
I just want to mention, Tyler, that last year I got distracted from it a bit, but last year I wrote a book, a collection of short stories trying to illustrate biosemiotic processes in little narratives, showing, trying to illustrate what I consider, what I'm trying to define analytically as these poetic processes in how we interact with our environment to create new ways of being in the world. And so I've been trying to put aside all my academic work and just work on this creative work, because I think that is what I can contribute, can best contribute to this conversation. So I'm going to go back and finish that collection now.
Yeah, I understand that. I understand whatever resistance some may feel to allowing this discussion of biosemiotics to become distracted by matters of style, which tend to be restricted to other applications of semiotics, because that's what makes this biosemiotics unique, is its specificity, I guess, and the scientific character of its discussion and its materials, and that's what prevents it from getting really watered down, and so on and so on. But we can look at style and aesthetics more specifically, and as long as it remains directed, then it can actually help to specify the biosemiotic work. And as I put in my summary, it can also definitely help to disseminate the biosemiotic thought among non-biologists. If they begin to see what I already recognize as a common trend in biosemiotic writings, is about this both a mood and another kind of textual trend, which I described already in the presentation. It could help, and that's where such work as your own can be decisive.
Okay. Do any of our old-time semi students here want to discuss the question about structural semiology? Jamin, is that what you want to talk about? Or Jamin, whatever you're.
Yes, actually. We did already land on this question, and I realized Tyler typed these up ahead of time. But one thing that I wanted to, well, one thing that didn't get mentioned, but I think Tyler already alluded to, why structural semiology is so important for biosemiotics and for keeping on the radar and not dismissing. In addition to the good points that Tyler made, all of the potential connections that tend to fly under the radar or get unnoticed based on sort of blanket hand waving and unfair dismissals, is that my sense is that structural semiology tends toward, even from the beginning, in the immediate post-Saussure era with Levi-Strauss and the early structuralists, but then especially as structuralism turned into post-structuralism, it tends toward the critique of ideology as if that's its end. And that will always be important. It will always be important for any discipline, but especially semiotics, because as Tyler's saying, as soon as ideology ossifies and no new insight can be brought to bear on a question, it ceases being meaningful. And if I'm speaking of reflexivity and recursivity, if we're serious about pursuit of meaning and understanding through science systems, making those explicit and understanding them, we can't allow ourselves to ossify. So constantly bringing in those insights from structural semiology will be important in kind of an inverse way that Paul has mentioned, that biosemiotics is crucial for general semiotics to integrate with. I think structural semiology is crucial to integrate with biosemiotics. That's my take.
Very happy to hear it from you. That's your opinion, because I agree completely. And I just saw Tori's comment pop up on the down below about ideology becoming its own ideology and so on and so on. Yes, of course, that's important. And the definition of ideology is critical and so on. But nevertheless, the insights, it's like commodity fetishism, for example, these insights, these are indispensable. Okay, there are plenty of problems with the classic approach to the critique of ideology, yes. But nevertheless, though, it doesn't matter. Like the insights are not, they cannot be tossed aside. So 100% agree.
Okay. Israel, do you want to take up the invitation to say a few words about non-human?
The question to Israel is very connected to what we were just talking about. And also Prieto's, just as a preamble to what Israel will say, Prieto's semiology is not just distinctively, not just linguistic, but also related to ideology critique.
Yeah.
Isn't that right, Israel?
Yes, indeed. But when it comes to the non-human aspect, it is kind of tricky, because so in Prieto's own writings, as such, he tends to well, it depends, because in his early writings, he is very, very clear that he's not just talking about language, especially in his first books. Well, his second book in this Messages and Signals. So it is about more like a general framework for studying communication or even signification. Towards the end of his life, he published an article in 87 about the problem of subjectivity and how semiology, or at least his theory, arrives to the problem of subjectivity. And there, he kind of leaves animals, well, or non-human animals aside, but and this is part of my ongoing thesis. Yeah, so the research, the monograph is because even if he does that, the claims the theoretical like scaffold he's building for tackling subjectivity from this semiological point of view, it seems that if we put it together with biosemiotics, it seems that it leads to no let's say incompatibilities. So because basically for Prieto, what defines a subject, it is the faculty of decision. So an ability to choose, and then because of this to carry on with proper practices and transformations of things. And so yeah, as for my research, I am, because it seems like he was like putting this division between nature and culture like too high. So it seems that it is just a matter of pushing it downwards, and then I think it can be indeed possible to bring like to create a like a proper Prietonian biosemiotics or biosemiology.
I believe in this prospect, and I would mention that Israel and Ludmila have been crucial assistants to me, because in fact I am not an expert semiologist specifically. My knowledge of foreign languages is not strong enough. But on the contrary, I mean, in contrast, Israel and Ludmila are the real masters, the hidden masters. And I've actually had a direct hand in writing and editing some of my things, and so we should definitely listen to them on this matter. But yes.
Okay, we're going to end pretty soon. Kalevi, did you want to address Tyler's question about echo? You know much more about echo's ideas than I do.
Let it leave for some further discussion, because that's so crucial question. Yeah.
I might direct something if he's still here. Let's see. I might direct something at Alexei.
Yeah, please do here.
Yes, I can tell you that proto-semiosis, comparing it with symbols is probably not appropriate, because in proto-semiosis it's more primitive, where agents can perceive objects. The same thing is with Sternfeld natural propositions, because that assumes that objects have properties, and these statements about objects can be true or false. However, in proto-semiosis, it's below that level, because objects are not perceived, and that's why there's no falseness in this sense. So the bacteria could not detect that something is true or false. It's simply acts according to its innate habits.
I agree. Yeah, of course, regarding the truth content. But what about Sternfeld's claim about proto-propositions? So your proto-semiosis and Sternfeld's proto-proposition, not the same thing.
No, not the same thing. So for me, natural propositions are reasonable assumptions only for the third person observer, for example, for a molecular biologist who examines the genetic code and interprets the genetic code as a proposition, as a, for example, adaptive feature. And then the biologist can evaluate whether this encoded proposition is adaptive or maladaptive, or for example, conditionally adaptive, but not for the cell that interprets this genetic code itself.
Yeah. Because when in Sternfeld, I think it's crucial in natural propositions, what he means by symbolic is something much simpler, and he makes the claim on the very turn to page 142 for clarification to his footnote, where he says that the symbol extends to the very simplest instances of semiosis, including the E. coli bacteria. And so we seem to be dealing with a fundamentally different kind of vocabulary.
It's better not to use such kind of statements. So I would reserve symbolic relations only to higher organisms like eukaryotes, at least. For animals.
Yes, I know, and it's the same with, I think, with Kalevi's application and with Deacon's application in, at least in symbolic species. But yes, see, this is going to be a matter of how we choose to use the vocabulary, because
right. And for Deacon's understanding of symbols, it's mostly human, and maybe some higher primates can also do that.
Right. I would say that I think this is one of the challenges that we have in the field in general. And what I tried to show, for example, when I was just talking about DNA, protein to DNA recursivity, we're really talking about some general principles that apply at many levels, but they apply it differently at those levels. In humans, it's the displacement effect at the level of inter-individual communication. At the level of the DNA story that I was just describing, it's a displacement, but it's certainly not symbols in the sense that we mean it. And yet this hierarchy of isomorphism, contiguity, and displacement shows up again and again, level upon level. Again, a recursive kind of relationship, so that by the time you get up to cognition, we've got many levels of infrastructure that it's built upon. Many levels of that, you might say, recursive hierarchy, the 1, 2, 3 hierarchy. To the question that you asked here about my own thinking about this at the very lowest level, the autogenic story, there's 3 levels to the autogenic story that you may be familiar with, and it's only the 3rd level where there's a template, where the constraints of the system are offloaded onto a molecular template, that you get displacement. And that's the point at which you have something that's capable of recursion. So what I would say, and that's when you suddenly get this open-ended evolution possible, because before that, when all the constraints in the autogenic process are, in a sense, holistically exhibited in the whole system, it doesn't have this ability to displace its own reference, so to speak, away from us. So if it's dumped onto a molecular structure, the molecular structure not being involved directly in the dynamics now can be a displaced part-whole reference. So the part now can reference the whole of which it's a part. Now you have true recursion possible. So that sort of hierarchy, I think, plays off again and again and again. And this, I think, goes back to what we were discussing earlier about the sort of within level and across level recursion and the importance of that difference. Let me just take that one step further, because when I first read your questions, when you say that semiotics is recursively, I mean, intrinsically recursive, I sort of reacted negatively to it. I subsequently thought, well, no, in fact, semiosis by itself is a kind of displacement. Even the simplest semiotic relationship is a kind of displacement, which therefore allows the kind of recursion that we always see in semiotic systems, that we wouldn't see in a system that doesn't have that kind of representational displacement. So because of what you said, I actually agree that it goes all the way down. But I think, like Alexei was saying, we have to be really careful about now distinguishing. We've got these terms that work, and they have sort of metaphors at all these levels, but we really do not have a way to separate those out so we can talk about it in its full hierarchic depth.
Okay, we have come to the end of this glade. I've just sent Tyler's dissertation to everyone. Tyler, I'd like you to say a few closing words if you'd like.
Can I ask one other question, Tyler? I missed the presentation, but if you had slides, I would love to see them.
I'll send them to you, no problem. Yeah.
Thank you.
I guess when Echo says convention, when Echo says all signs are conventional, he means habit. That's what I mean. That's what he means. So some will take his conventionalism as critique of Echo, but he just means habit. That's all.
Your final statement on the matter. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. I'll let Kalevi close it out. Thank you, Tyler. Kalevi?
Yeah, and so we will meet again. We'll just correspond with Jamin and Paul, and the idea is also about Frederick. So and when we will get an agreement about dates, so we'll inform everybody. So see you again and have a very nice.
While I'm downloading Tyler's dissertation, don't close this out quite yet, because that download link will fall away.
Okay, we can stay. I'll stay on. It's your host, so you need to stay on. You want to put up your slides on the same chat, Tyler? You can do it right now. No, not now. Okay.
I'll just email them to Terry, but if someone else wants my slides, just